Got to tell you, students, that the best laid plans of mice and men sometimes get fouled up. I was recording this lecture. I got into it. I had gravel in my gut and spit in my eye, and I was making progress. And then people started mowing the lawns outside. Since I was hiring a boy to mow our lawns, I had to go out and tell him to stop. When I did that, I lost my lecture. Hey, it's just the way it is. Okay, I'm Dr. Winkler. We're moving on with my recordings of the History 151G class. I'm going to the point where I'm going to start talking about modern Japan. Japan is an extremely important country in Asia. It's important for a lot of reasons. Its wealth, its power, its extension of power. Japan actually is the first nation of Asia to actually take upon itself basic ideas we see coming from Western Europe. Forms of government, it's eventually going to be very important. Forms of government, industrialization, creating a large military establishment, and the expansion of power. Japan is going to be a shaker and mover in Asia for a very lengthy period of time. Militarily until 1945. Then after that, until the recent time, even as you and I speak, economically it's going to be a powerhouse. So we need to understand Japan to understand Asia. So let's take a look at it. Get my mouse here, and we will progress as best I can. Well, we usually look at the government of Japan as, and we call it feudal. By that I mean it has some similarities between the feudal system which we see in the Middle Ages in Europe. The feudal system in Europe and in Japan tends to have a landlord, someone who owns land. In Europe, we can call it it's a number of noble titles, including count, baron, and a bunch of others. In Japan, the landowner is called the shogun. As you know, in the Middle Ages, there's frequent warfare. Various nations you attacked by external forces, the Vikings, Avars, Magyars, and others that are coming in, and you need the ability to defend yourself. However, you actually get into a mentality when you start fighting among yourselves, among these feudal groups. To accomplish this, you have to have a warrior class. The warrior class in Europe we call the knights. They are practiced at arms, usually from the time frame when they're little boys. They practice at arms, they know how to take care of their equipment, and they become very, very proficient. There is also a warrior class. In Japan, it's called the samurai. While Japan does not have to deal with the problems of external invasions that we see in Europe, there's internal warfare going on. So the warrior class, the samurai, are supposed to defend the power, shall we say, the authority of the shogun for whom they work. The samurai have a reputation for being exceptional warriors. They're highly motivated. They have a strong tendency to become expert at weapons. They can do the kinds of things with weapons that they're really quite stunning. For example, they got on horseback, and you can ride on horseback and you pull out an arrow and you can start to hit all kinds of targets at a full gallop on a horse, which is very, very challenging. Of course, when you're down on the ground, these men are very well practiced at arms as well. They have samurai swords, which are very famous, which you use in various configurations, and you can be extremely talented. The military mentality, as an ideal, does influence Japanese mentality and Japanese culture. A warrior ethic, if you will, is called Bushido. And this becomes very important in Japan up and including into the 19th century, the 1800s, where now you have taken a warrior ethic and tried to make it as shall we say, as powerful as possible to do your work. This is Bushido. We call it the way of the warrior. What's involved here? Well, you can look back at the samurai and already say we do have a military ethic. But let's look at the emphasis of Bushido. It includes emperor worship. That's a little bit different than the samurai, who have a tendency to support the issues of the shogun. In the 19th century, when we have the Meiji Restoration, there's now a strong emphasis on emperor worship. In fact, you're supposed to believe that the emperor himself is divine, kind of a god man. So you worship him, his will is your will. You should have loyalty. Obviously, loyalty is very, very similar to emperor worship. You should have loyalty to the emperor. You should have loyalty to his programs. Honor. Honor means different things in different societies. It depends on your social outlook. Some people's honor would state that I will be honest in my dealings. That when I start a project, I will finish it. That I'll be a good religious person. That can be part of the ethic of honor in various societies. Under Bushido, your honor is to always be a good warrior, to never retreat, never surrender, continue to fight. Austerity. Austerity means you live a very simple life. You're not living in a palace wearing silk garments. You're not living the high life, eating really good food. Austerity. You can survive on less. You can go without food, sometimes 4 days. You can, this enormous self-discipline. You can overcome obstacles because you can live simply. This does dovetail into our next point of discussion, which happens to be self-sacrifice. You are there to serve the will of the emperor. You are there to sacrifice everything you can in order to make sure that you are quite disciplined and you support the emperor. All of this is going to go within the warrior ethic, which we are going to see them use, the Japanese use as they expand. Well, Japan is a closed country. They don't want foreigners coming in. Oh my goodness. They like their society where it is. Well, then there's the Americans. The Americans decide they're going to open up Japan to trade. Pull up Matthew Perry here, an important American. We often call him Commodore Perry. A Commodore is just an old term for admiral. The U.S. Navy is not very big in 1853, so they have very few admirals, very few Commodores. He's one of them. Why is the United States messing with Japan? Good question. The United States, primarily at the end of the war with Mexico, 1848, have taken California. Now, it is widely believed, even though it's going to be a long time down the road, that the Americans will eventually try to bring a rail line all the way to California. As you know, later on we call it this Transcontinental Railroad, which is completed in 1869. But before that time frame, the way you get to California is actually by wagon, largely. Yeah, you can go around South America, long, long trip, by ship. But largely you go across by wagon, which is very inefficient. It is believed by the Americans that when there is a transcontinental railroad, that there can be very strong economic contact between Asia and California. As you all know, one of the finest natural harbors in the world is San Francisco Bay. Let's open up Japan. Let's get Japan willing to trade with the Americans. So Matthew Perry, Commodore Perry, shows up in Tokyo Bay with a large number of ships. And the Japanese say, you're foreigners. We don't like foreigners. Go get lost. Well, he's got military prowess. Immediately, the Japanese realize he's got cannon. And they look at the cannon that the Americans are using going, oh my goodness, these are very, very strong. These are superior cannon. And maybe our cannon in comparison to them are weak. Now, Perry really puts on a show for them. In fact, he brought over, can I get Perry's train here? He didn't have a large locomotive. Probably won't find anything. Whatever. I've seen pictures of this before. And to me, it's kind of amusing. They had a small train. As you can see, this is a miniature locomotive. This is not a big train that's going to take you from city to city. This is kind of a toy. However, it is a functional toy. And Commodore Perry drops a few rail lines, puts this out on the shore, and shows the Japanese what the Americans, of course, other countries, are capable of doing. This shakes up the Japanese in a very real sense. Look at this. We can no longer remain isolated because our enemies or our competitors can come into our place, come into our area here. And in doing so, they can push us around. They're not going to go home. They're going to continue coming back. And we're behind. We're behind in so many ways. We've got to modernize. We've got to catch up. We've got to start building our own trains. We've got to enhance our military. The Meiji Restoration. The power structure in Japan is a little topsy-turvy this time frame. And when, of course, you have the Americans come in and trying to force trade with Japan, who's going to be in control? Going back to Bushido, the idea of emperor worship. We get what we call the Meiji Restoration. In other words, the emperor now has more authority. Usually after 1868, we start to make the argument that this is when Japan really takes off in modernization. Yes, the door was open in 1853, but 1868, Japan really takes off. It has reforms, try to make it modern reforms. Some of these are political. Yes, the emperor clearly has the will of God behind him. But they actually look at the Western forms of government saying, well, shouldn't we have a parliament? Modern, okay, reforms in government, reforms in society. Yes, we still have upper class people. They don't go away. But trying to work for the, shall we say, to get the support of broader numbers of people, and not just the shogunates and not just the samurai, but larger segments of society. Because they look at other nations in the West and see a freer society, well, maybe their strength would be enhanced by this kind of effort, by more free people. Then there's the issue of industrial. Can we say industry is really what makes you powerful as a nation? We've already mentioned this when we're talking about industrialization, where iron, steel production, when you have mechanisms, we have rail lines, the wealth of your nation goes up, and the power and influence of your nation goes up dramatically. This nation has been literally sitting over by themselves for a lengthy period of time, are now in a situation where they want to expand and show their power. Japan started in the 1870s, industrializes very rapidly. I've already mentioned this in different contexts. It's easier to industrialize rapidly when you come later to the game. One of the reasons is this, that you don't have to invent everything. For example, the Japanese do not have to invent the train. That's been done already. They don't have to invent the mechanisms by which you produce things. They don't have to invent how you make iron and steel, because that's been done by somebody else. And when the government gets involved in a very real way in helping industry, giving them loans, remember I mentioned earlier, a lot of times these loans is really free money. So you get loans, you get rights of way, you get access to resources, you get access to shipbuilding. You can industrialize very rapidly. There's another idea which the Japanese largely get from their religion, from Buddhist. This is called Shinto. It's very old. It's way, way back. Ancient religion, yeah, it's largely Buddhist. As fascinating as Japan is in many respects, somehow the idea of Buddhism sounds a little bit funny to Westerners who believe in Christianity. According to Buddhists, among other things, you should not be vain about yourself. You shouldn't brag yourself up because you're unworthy. You can accomplish a lot of things, but you have to be very, very careful, at least as far as your bragging yourself up is concerned. Okay, so it's largely Buddhist. It is militarist. It is expansionist. Why would you want to be militaristic? Well, let's look at some of your Western powers. Some of your greatest powers are in the West are nations like Germany, like France, like Britain, who have large military contingents. And if you want to make sure that Americans and any other nationality can't come over and push you around, you better have a good idea that you can defend yourself. However, being able to defend yourself is only part of the program. You want to expand as well. You don't want to be hedged up on these islands we call Japan. You want to be able to expand. Why? At exactly the same time frame, we've already discussed this, there's a spectacular land grab going on. European countries, Russia, France, Britain, are among the most important of these, are out grabbing large sections of the world, largely in Africa, but also a pretty good chunk of people in Asia as well. Well, if these other nations are doing it, why shouldn't Japan? The same justification, which are almost always weak. We have a right to do it. We're stronger. The strong shall prey upon the weak. Europeans are doing this. Why shouldn't Japan do it as well? There's something else that's another problem, and that's natural resources. Japan is industrializing very rapidly. It needs coal and it needs iron ore. It has very little of each. Where are you going to get it? Well, you can trade for it. But how about grab it? I mean, let's go all the way back to honor. Does your honor not state that it'd be much better for you to go out and take it rather than trade for it? See, Japan looks around at its country. And Japan, even though Japan is industrializing, usually when we have a nation that industrializes, we do see progress in virtually all the social classes. Even the lower classes tend to benefit, but they tend not to benefit as much as the upper classes. In Japan, because of largely a lack of natural resources, Japan's people are poor. They're quite poor. Japan had what, about 70 million people this time frame? Japan looks at this and says, by the way, our people are living too modestly. We do have the right to expand. We do have the right to grab colonies. And we do have the right, very importantly, to grab natural resources to make sure our people can live at a higher standard of living. So Japan starts looking in various directions. The First Sino-Japanese War, 1894 to 1895. Sino essentially means China. So the Japanese are going to go to war with China. Maybe my lecture is a little out of sequence. I haven't talked an awful lot about China. China is having trouble modernizing. And China is also having trouble being pushed around. by the Western powers, who are trying to carve up economic enclaves into China. China is a big nation, and they have not been able to fully bring their resources to bear in a military manner. So actually, they become an easy mark. So the Japanese beat the Chinese in the First Sino-Japanese War, 1894 to 95. As a consequence of this, Japan's territories are expanded quite dramatically. Let's see. Can I get a, how about maps of Asia? Show you essentially where these, oh, okay. So essentially where these areas are. Let's go over our map of Asia. China and island nations, you can see right off the coast here. They take Taiwan, right down here. Taiwan is sometimes, as you know, also called Formosa. This is totally Chinese speaking. These are ethnically Chinese. Well, then they also take Korea. Korea has a challenging history. Unfortunately for Korea, it's been too close to China. And as we get into the 20th century, it becomes a bone of contention. First between the Japanese and the Chinese, and later on, after the Second World War, becomes a very big bone of contention during the Cold War, where you have a communist regime fighting a military dictatorship, North and South Korea. Well, let's take a look at this. Now, the Japanese are a little bit like the Europeans. I'm not saying all the Europeans were awful when they came in, but many of them were. Remember, I made a big discussion of the Congo, and also there's repression going on in places like India. The Japanese, can we say, are worse? They look at these people as inferior, and they dominate them by force, by coercion, by brutality and terror. Well before the invasion of China, the big invasion in 1937, the Japanese have already shown themselves to be willing to push around other peoples. Well, let's look at the Russo-Japanese War. Now we have a major European power. It's Russia. Russia has holdings all the way over here. Usually when we look at the history of Russia, we do have a tendency to look at it on the basis of what it's doing in Europe and its involvement in the First World War and Second World War and the Cold War. Sometimes we forget that it has enormous holdings going across Siberia, all the way over here. Where is the port of Vladivostok? I was hoping that would show up here. Well, here we go, Vladivostok right there. That's where I thought it was at. I'm glad they didn't move it on me. Russia's trying to make this a major port because now they have access to the Pacific. Well, how is Russia, who has largely its industry and its population in the western part of Russia, how are they going to become involved over here? Well, the Trans-Siberian Railroad. It's not done in 1904 and 1905. To transport goods and services at this time frame during the Russo-Japanese War, the Russians are going to have to put their material on trains. Going to have to take them over several time zones. But it doesn't go all the way to Vladivostok. So when you get to the end of the rails, then you're going to have to put your goods, your weapons, your supplies, your manpower on wagons and take them all the way down here. You see, it's terribly inefficient. How can the Russians actually do this and be effective? Russia has a navy. It is way back. I really got to expand this one out. It's way back. All right. It's way back over here, largely in the Baltic right there. And now they're at war with Japan. Yes, the Suez Canal had been dug by France in the 1860s. So anyway, what the Russians have to do to fight Japan on the sea, they take their navy and take it all the way across over here to fight Japan. That in and of itself is a good story. Okay, you got the fleet, you got to have coaling stations, you got to guys together, and very lengthy. They come over here, and the Japanese Navy is not impressed and sinks them. The Japanese beat the Russians on land. The Japanese beat the Russians on the sea. Can we say that Russia is fighting with great disadvantages? Be that as it may, the Japanese are showing themselves capable, at least in their own minds, of defeating a European power, both on land and on sea. Just to throw a little water on the First World War as we're making this discussion. It's not like in 1914 that it was unforeseeable using modern weapons that you'd have to dig trenches to survive. What happened in the Russo-Japanese War? Both sides were building trenches because of artillery and machine gun and advanced rifle fire. If they have to do it here, is there a good chance that you're going to be able to evade that in 1914 in Europe? Probably not. They should have looked at this maybe more carefully. Not only the Europeans failed to learn this lesson about trenches, but they also failed to learn another lesson. Because the example is different over here. The example I'm trying to make is there are times when the Japanese are facing the Russians in their trenches. The Japanese, of course, are very inspired and they're very highly disciplined, and they come running in there, and at times they're able to break through Russian trenches. So, particularly France and other countries, during the First World War say, well, we can do this. We have the example of the Japanese. Unfortunately, the Japanese experience was an anomaly, not something you should actually follow. And in having heavy infantry attacks during the First World War ends up in a very large casualty rate, and many people are slaughtered. Many men are killed. So you defeat a European power. Can we say Japan is filling its oats? Oh, of course. Sometimes we forget that the Japanese were our allies, the allies of the United States starting in 1917, and the allies of the Western powers during the First World War. How far away is the major fighting during the First World War? It's way over here. Japan's not going to send its navy over there. It's not going to send its combat troops over there. So why does Japan become involved in this? Well, as part of the colonial urge, the Germans had come into the game late. So they're running around the world kind of grabbing up anything that nobody's grabbed yet. One, of course, is, we've already mentioned in the context, Namibia, German Southwest Africa. They grab a few areas over here in Africa as well. They go over into the seas. There's a sea over here called the Bismarck Sea, which is essentially named because the Germans had come over here and grabbed a few islands. It's important to remember this. Japan comes in, they're our allies, they're our friends. They are really not there to change what's happening in Europe, but they're here to just grab what they can. Grab the German colonies, they can expand that way. Some of these islands, including Guadalcanal, the Americans are going to have to retake during the Second World War. But anyway, the Japanese get them fairly early because of this. There is a difference between World War I and World War II. During World War II, the Japanese treat prisoners of war abysmally. They're beaten, sometimes they're just killed, and I'm not exaggerating. Sometimes they're killed just for the fun of it. They're starved, they're brutalized, they're tortured. During the First World War, prisoners of war by the Japanese, you don't have too many problems, do you? Not really. They don't treat these men badly. Since they give them enough to eat, they're not beaten or anything. And when the war's over, they send them home. This is going to be very different later on. Brutality and discipline by the Japanese. You want to have a system that is as effective as possible. Brutality and discipline. You copy the best that there is. We've already talked about industrialization. You copy the West because the West industry is very good. The best army in the world, most people would say, is the German army. Highly disciplined. Sometimes we call this iron discipline. When your officers say you do something, you do it. The same size units, same size companies, same size divisions. Sometimes even the same kind of weapons mix. Rifles and machine guns when you to a certain configuration, is similar to the German army. The best Navy in the world, hands down, everybody knows this, is the British Navy. The British are building a very large battleship, starting with the HMS Dreadnought. We call this the Dreadnought class battleship. One of the reasons why Japan is able to beat the Russians in the Russo-Japanese War on the seas is because the Japanese are following the latest possible ship designs, so they do not have to be technically at a disadvantage against the Russians. I've already mentioned Parliament. Unfortunately for Japanese history, the Parliament, at least the time frame we're discussing, does not really function well. You still have a lot of deference to the emperor. And there's going to be a big problem in undermining representative government in Japan because there's going to be political assassinations. You can go all the way back up to honor. My honor says that these people disagree with me, do not have the honor of existing. We should kill them. Political assassinations. This gets, well, any assassination, I think, is one assassination too many. But can we say to a certain extent, it actually gets out of hand. When the actor Charlie Chaplin, who is, I admire this man, extremely good actor, comedian, producer, one of the greatest geniuses in film that we've ever seen. He visited Japan, I believe it was 1927, and there was a clique of people saying, we ought to kill him. He's going to be there for a while. He's going to look around. He's going to go home. Why is he a threat to you? If you start assassinating, murdering political rivals, not only do you eliminate these people because they're dead, but you can see how widely you could intimidate everybody else in the system. Because either you get along with us or we're going to potentially kill you. Who's doing the assassination? Largely political groups. Excuse me, I said that wrong. Largely military groups. And that's one of the reasons why Japan gets involved in expansion and a series of wars against China, other Europe and European countries, and later on against the United States as well. Let's take Japan up to the Second World War. Let's go down here a little ways. Well, what does Japan want? The Greater East Asia Cold Prosperity Sphere. In other words, a Japanese empire. Oh, it looks good. It looks good. Greater East Asia Cold Prosperity Sphere. We are cooperating with each other. We are going to come together and we are going to control areas, and in doing so, we're going to bring goodness to everybody. Japanese Empire. Let's try a map, see if that helps us. Yeah, I always do this. I never learn. Let's go back and try images. All right. The Japanese Empire. Let's see if in the time frame we're discussing. it eventually does end up being very, very large. Does that one help us? Yeah, the extent of this is during the Second World War. You can see the large areas that Japan will take by force, will conquer. Before they've done all of this, remember they've already got Korea, they've already got Taiwan, but they want to continue to expand. They want more natural resources. They want more peoples that are under their control. Invasion of Manchuria. Manchuria is right up here. What do the Japanese want from Manchuria? Well, just dominating anything is to their advantage, at least they think. Look at the map and say, wow, let's be proud of what Japan holds. On the other hand, there are natural resources in Manchuria. They can get ore there, which they need. You put them on ships. You take this back to Japan to feed Japanese industry. Now, look at the date. This is 1931. When we were discussing the colonial rule, remember I essentially took up the time frame up until about 1914. Then you have the First World War. I'm not saying the European powers don't expand after that, because a good example is at the end of the First World War, Great Britain and France divided up the Middle East. Remember, the Middle East had been controlled by Turkey. Of course, Turkey is on the German side during the First World War. They lose. Among other things, they're going to lose control of a lot of people, including in the Middle East. Saudi Arabia, Palestine, Syria, Iraq, those areas. And you do have a situation by which I think my wife got that. So let's continue. Been lucky in this class. We don't really have a large number of interruptions. Today I've had a couple, lawnmower and the phone. But nonetheless, we've been lucky overall, and I'm very pleased to say that. Okay, invasion of Manchuria in 1931. This is seen as aggression. Now wait a minute. Had this happened, let's say 1910, 1900, people say, oh sure, everybody's doing that. Can we say it's burned off? Even though France and Britain had taken the Middle East largely in 1919. After that, people aren't interested anymore. It's seen as aggression. It's seen as unnecessary. The idea of imperialism is really on the wane. So, well, you've taken all of this. Then it really, really does get to be horrific. Japan looks over here at China. China has a lot more people than Japan does, but its military is not as strong. It has not yet been able to organize enough to bring its forces, shall I say, its resources together to create industry. I've already mentioned one of China's problems is that there's too much interference from foreigners, from foreign nations. The Japanese say, well, look, we took Manchuria. Yeah, people protested, but that doesn't really make any difference because they didn't do anything. Well, let's take China. Whoa. Okay. China is one big country. China has hundreds of millions of people, heavily outnumbering the manpower, let's say the population of Japan. Therefore, Japan has a lot less manpower than the Chinese do. However, the Japanese are disciplined. They have better equipment. Therefore, they think, because of their inherent superiority. I think I have this down here. If not, I'll mention it right now. And that is, they believe that they are superior in their culture, and we can say superior as human beings. They're superior genetically to other people. It's not just the Europeans that are saying, look, we have a right to dominate black and brown people because of an inherent superiority. The Japanese over in Asia saying, we have a right to dominate other people because we are superior as well, and they are inferior. We say they're buying into certain aspects of social Darwinism. Certainly we can. Well, the Sino-Japanese War. The men that are pushing for this, and one thing I should have up here, which I did not. In 1936, just before the invasion of China, the Japanese military people knock off, assassinate some important political leaders who are saying that we do not need to expand anymore. This is challenging. To dominate China might not work. But the sense of honor of the military says, no, no, no. We're not going to trade for what we can take. Our honor demands we expand and conquer. So in knocking off political leaders, can we say at least as 1936, there is a very, very big movement now where the military is controlling what's happening in Japan. So an invasion, 1937. Starts late in the summer. In their exuberance to think they can do this, the Japanese actually think this will be an easy conquest. Now, if the Chinese didn't fight at all, just moving enough manpower in enough areas to control China would be very doubtful. But when the Chinese resist, the Chinese army is poor. I've already mentioned that. The Chinese are poorly led, they're poorly trained, the discipline is bad. Sometimes when the Japanese come up and grab their samurai swords and come running up, and the Chinese, unfortunately, rather than staying fighting in many cases, run away. Even at that, and Japan sends something like 70 divisions, very, very large number of manpower over to China. It is not an easy conquest. In fact, it's a conquest that they are never successful. Yeah, they take large sections, big sections of China over here, but they never dominate. Let's just take one step forward and look just a little bit at the Second World War. The Americans, and I'll mention this later again, the Americans essentially beat Japan single-handed. Got to go 5,000 miles across the Pacific and defeat a powerful nation while you're also sending most of your resources to fight in Europe. The Americans are capable of phenomenal kinds of things. Well, there are vicious battles, as you well know, very famous battles. Battle of Okinawa is the biggest one. There's very vicious fighting on Iwo Jima, Peleliu, Kwajalein. There's Philippines. There's a lot of fighting going on. And Americans do fight the Japanese, and Americans win. But one thing we should perhaps remember in this discussion is that when the Americans are fighting over here, they're really not fighting the bulk of the army. What they're fighting is actually garrisons that are left on various islands. The army of Japan is engaged over here throughout the war. The United States did not have to deal with all of these, but China does. Well, there's an advance. The Chinese, of course, bring in their navy. They have this very good military. They come in, they land their troops, and they march inland. The United States has economic interests in China. A lot of countries do. There is a gunboat that the United States has. I believe it's near the mouth of the river by Nanking. And it's a U.S. ship. It's called the Panay. We have actually newsreel footage of this. The attack on the Panay. Let's see if I can get a photograph of the Panay, maybe even under attack. It's quite interesting. Some of the men were asleep when the attack took place. They don't even get dressed. In the Navy, we call these skivvies. Your skivvies are your underwear. You see these guys running out in their boxer shorts, grabbing machine guns and trying to defend themselves against Japanese attack. Here's the Panay. It's not a big ship. The Panay was attacked by the Japanese. It's not depicted here, but the Panay's flying the American flag. By agreements with China, they had every right to be there. They're not, it's not the Americans are in foreign waters. Even on the deck of the Panay, there's a very large American flag. There can be no doubt whatsoever in the minds of the Japanese pilots that in reality this is an American ship. The Americans tried to defend themselves using machine guns. They fire at the planes. Now bombs go off, hit in the water nearby. It's hit. Several men are killed and it's sunk. Why am I making such a big deal over this? Maybe I shouldn't even mention it. Just a small incident. But I will say in 1937, had the United States been belligerent and decided that they wanted to interfere in Asia, is interfere the right word? To come in and stop what was happening, they've got the excuse that they want. Now, it's awfully hard to argue counterfactuals. What would have happened had not? What would have been happened had different decisions been made? Can we say that maybe the viciousness of the war could have been lessened had the United States came in earlier? We could perhaps make that argument. On the other hand, had they come in, many Americans would say, wait a minute, for the sunk a boat out here, and now you're going to send in hundreds of thousands of men to put at harm's way. See, that probably wouldn't have worked. The Japanese apologize, and nothing happens. Nanking. This is one of the Japanese are committing atrocities. Almost everywhere they go. One of the more celebrated is the wrong word. One of the more well documented, at least from the West, one of the most well examined, at least from the standpoint of Western historians, is the rape of Nanking. The Japanese come into the city of Nanking. I'd like to get it on a map. Maybe I will be successful and maybe not. Let's get in here. I guess it's not terribly important. It's not Shanghai. I believe that's it up here. In any event, right on the coast, the Japanese, of course, want ports. They want to grab this as rapidly as possible. Oh, here it is. I'm sorry. It's inland a little bit more. So the Japanese come in and Japanese take military brutality almost, I want to say, higher than anything we've ever seen. Well, you want to go back to Genghis Khan and some other people that slaughter their enemies. Yeah, this kind of thing's gone on before, but it's enormously disturbing that no provocation. You see, the army, the Chinese army, put up a kind of a show defense of Nanking and immediately withdrew. When the Japanese moved in, the rape, the pillage, the plunder, the slaughter is absolutely enormous. I'm not trying to offend people. I know it's very disturbing. It is to me as well. But some of these photographs which were taken, so all this is very well documented, what the Japanese were doing. This is from a newsreel, a Chinese baby who has been burned. His parents are probably dead, crying in its agony because of what the Japanese have done. In the Japanese army, when they're coming in, you want to make sure your men are callous. You want to make sure your men will do whatever they're asked to do. even if maybe they don't want to do it. One of the things the Japanese would do is they take prisoners. These aren't prisoners of war because these people aren't technically in the military. These are just Chinese people. And they tie them up to posts. They're alive, and now you have bayonet practice on living human beings. You yell, you scream, you come in with your bayonet. The Japanese have rifles, long bayonets on them. You come in, tear the people's guts open. And of course, that doesn't immediately kill you, so you die in agony as your guts and your blood spill out on the ground. You can't excuse this. This goes beyond anything that you could possibly rationalize. Women are raped. Thousands of women are raped. When I show you the severed heads, the Japanese like samurai swords, so they cut off people's heads. They rape women, sometimes take little girls who are physically not capable of withstanding that. So the effort of being gang raped ends up in their death. Children slaughtered, thrown away. There's a book on this called The Rape of Nanking. I've started, I can't get through it. It's too hard. It's too tough. Taking human beings, nailing their tongues to boards. I mean, my God. And we're watching this happen. Many years ago, I had the honor of interviewing a man who was in the Marine Corps. And during the Second World War. His name is Keith Renstrom. He died just a couple of years ago. He's like 97. This guy had a very long life. He's very interested in talking about his experiences. He attacked like 3 different islands. He was wounded twice. He was shot through the leg at Saipan. On Iwo Jima, a grenade blew up in his face. He even still got some scars on him from that experience. And in these interviews, they have been transcribed. You can go over to BYU and read them if you want to. In interviewing him, you try to keep people going if you interview well. And I happened to ask him, it was really a stupid question. He joined the Marines before the Second World War started. Now, he said when he was going down to San Diego for basic training, that one of the men on the train with him, he asked this man, why are you joining the Marine Corps? It's a good question. Guy says, remember, this is Depression era United States. He says, I will now get some food. I'll get 3 meals a day. But I asked a stupid question. I asked Keith Renstrom, why did you join? I expected, the patriotism, the honor of the country, the strength of the Marine Corps. His father had been a Marine during the First World War. It was a stupid question, but I got a very good answer. He said, do you want to know the truth? And I said, yes. He said, I knew what the Japanese were doing to the Chinese. And if there's anything I could do to prevent it, I'd be willing to do that. There's an enclave, an American missionary. Her name is Minnie Vautrin. And Minnie Vautrin is there to Christianize the Chinese. In doing so, she sets up a school for girls. And of course, she lives in a place, kind of a compound school. And when you have these kind of things, you don't have young women, shall we say, being victimized by young men. So you try to keep them essentially in a barracks. And of course, you have a wall around it. It's essentially like a compound. During the rape in Nanking, Minnie Vautrin puts up the American flag. Now, this is kind of challenging for the Japanese. My goodness, we got egg in our face over the Panay incident. Do we really want to have another incident? Do we really want to keep on egging the Americans? Thousands, many thousands of largely young women escaping, being gang raped by the Japanese, fleeing to the compound. You can imagine the problems Minnie Vautrin would have. as far as hygiene is concerned and feeding, and keeping these Japanese from getting the compound. However, as long as the American flag is flying, whoa, the Japanese are reluctant to come in. As we read accounts of this, the Japanese, of course, try to intimidate her and coerce her into allowing them in, or sending these women out, the young women out. Some eyewitnesses said that one Japanese officer slapped her 3 times. In her diary, he said that he slapped her. She didn't mention how many times. She's being physically intimidated by a Japanese officer, and she won't budge. You're not touching my people. She saved thousands of people by having the moral courage to stand up. Many of us are Americans. I think Americans ought to brag about themselves a little bit more than they do. I have a lot of heroes in history that are Americans, and you never hear about them. They don't end up in your textbooks. We don't talk about them in schools, but they're there. We need to be proud of them. Look at her death date. Should we get Minnie Vautrin up here? Let's get Minnie up here. Looks like a regular, nice lady. Young, graduating from school. And by the time we get to the 1930s, she's a middle-aged woman, looking very much like middle-aged women do. After the international community started paying more attention to what happened to Nanking, after a few months, Vautrin was actually able to remove her girls while the foreigners were watching into places of greater safety. However, she didn't stay there during the war. It's a very dangerous place to be for obvious reasons. She came back to the United States in 1941. She said, I could not live with the fact I could not save more. 1941, she killed herself. Back when we used to cook with gas, I remember this as a kid, before everything was electric, we had gas stoves. I remember this very well. You want the burners on top to cook your soup or whatever, and you turn on the gas and strike a match, have a nice little flame come up. In the oven, of course, when you want to bake something, Mom wants to bake bread in the oven, you go in there, you turn on the gas, and you put in the match, and it comes out. Well, the gas is lethal. Not only, so wonder we never blew the house up, throwing matches into this gas all the time. To my knowledge, that really didn't happen to anybody, but a lot of people had gas ranges like we did. The gas is lethal. She turned on the gas, put her head in the oven, and killed herself. Now, she's not the only person that's doing this. There's a German. This man is a member of the Nazi Party. And however, I think he was a businessman. And however, he has some holdings, some interests in Nanking. He has a little, kind of like a business, and you have the wall, and you have some buildings here flying the Nazi flag. Now, Japan is not an ally of Nazi Germany yet. But once again, Germany's a powerful country, and as far as being racist and brutal, the Japanese and the Nazis really have a lot in common. So the Japanese don't really want to offend the Nazis. As Minnie Vautrin set up a safe zone, John Raba set up a safe zone as well. He actually believed, even though Nazi Germany is racist and brutal, he actually believed that if Hitler had known what was going on in Nanking, Hitler would have done something to stop it. We say everybody, therefore, who's a member of the Nazi Party does not believe the same way. He's a moral Nazi. That's almost a contradiction in terms. Well, Hitler didn't care, obviously. Well, another example of somebody who took a moral stance, and he saved hundreds, if not a few thousand lives in his efforts. It's hard to excuse this. So I mentioned before I'm from Tooele. When I grew up, there were a number of Japanese living in Tooele. There'd been some up in Brigham City as well. These are Japanese Americans. I'm not sure of the history of their families, but I believe this is what had happened. During the 1940s, 1942 starting, the Japanese Americans on the West Coast were put in what we call relocation centers, which is actually a nice word for a concentration camp, where people, Japanese Americans, were put into behind barricades, behind barbed wire, where you had guards there with guns to make sure these people wouldn't do what? I'm not sure. Get out, I guess. And there was an exclusionary zone after a while. You didn't have to remain in the camps, but Japanese Americans could live in other areas. And some of them came to Tooele. Tooele has an army depot. Tooele has jobs. These guys in high school with me, they're on the wrestling team with me. Nice guys. Yeah, I really liked them. Never had any feelings about the Japanese except positive feelings. But then I get reading about World War II as an adult, and I go, oh my golly, now I've got to deal with the prejudice. It's a terrible prejudice. It's hard for me to look at the Japanese in as nearly as optimistic light as I had them. My personal experience with Japanese, not just Japanese Americans, is very positive. There was one time I was in Switzerland. I was so sick. I felt so awful. I'm not feeling very well. I walked over to a drinking fountain, got a drink of water. There's this guy. I think he's Japanese. He certainly was Oriental. Whatever language he spoke, we didn't speak the same language. He smiled at me. He looked at me, and he gave me a plum. Small gesture made me feel better, made me feel a lot better. I've never forgotten that. I have to believe, from everything I've seen and everything I know about the Japanese people, they are kind and they are decent and they're benevolent. So how do I explain the brutality of the Japanese during the Second World War? It's not an easy explanation. I'm going to have to make an argument. It's not the people, it's the brutal system, which was created by the Japanese military, that forced these men to do probably what they would never do under any other circumstances. Well, the Japanese are expanding. The United States, even though the United States does not come in to defend China, the United States is not very happy what's going on. President Roosevelt really thinks this is horrible. So let's see what the Japanese decide to do. Well, okay, what the Japanese decide to do. I'm compressing perhaps a little bit more than I should the time frame. Let's go back here. The Japanese are getting coal and iron ore, largely from Manchuria, to run their industry. They're not getting natural resources in this vicious war that goes on and on and on over in China. They have to have one thing that they don't have up here, and that's petroleum. Indonesia, which is controlled by Holland, or the Netherlands down here, you can get oil from them. However, where the Japanese are getting most of their oil is from the United States. They're getting scrap metal. They go across the Pacific from the various ports in the United States, Portland, San Francisco, San Diego. Did I say Portland? I should have said Seattle. That are sending natural resources to Japan. The United States has been isolationist. The United States Congress is watching the president very careful. Let's not get us involved in another war. Over time, however, as the war in Europe gets more brutal, and time, however, as the Japanese, remember this is in the newsreels while they're doing it over there, we say Congress backs off a little bit, and now the American president, President Roosevelt, decides that he can start using the force of the United States to coerce Japan, at least Japan, to back off. In the summer of 1941, President Roosevelt freezes the assets, the economic assets of Japan and the United States. In other words, you can't really trade with us anymore. More importantly, for the Japanese war machine, the United States will no longer be sending scrap metal to the Japanese so they can build the weapons. And even more importantly, Roosevelt says, we're not going to send you any more oil. You've got to have oil for your war machine. You've got to have oil for your trucks, your aircraft, and most importantly, your ships. So now what's Japan going to do? They can move down here and take Indonesia and use Indonesian oil to support their war machine. Why don't they trade for it? Well, once again, you don't trade for things which you can conquer. On the other hand, the Philippines are right here, and the Philippines are an American colony. And the United States has bases. Not an awful lot of manpower, but they have manpower, they have aircraft here. Japan tries to dominate this. Guess who's right in the way? The United States. So Japan decides, get a better map here for the, no, that's not terribly good. Japan decides to go to war against the United States. Ooh. Let's look at this. Everybody knows the power in industry and manpower the United States has. My goodness, they're the industrial powerhouse of the world. Large amounts of resources, large amounts of oil, steel and coal production, #1 in the world. With the United States' large manpower pool, you can obviously, if you want to, can take a large number of men and transport them long distances. The Japanese taking on the United States is like walking into a bar and picking a fight with the Green Bay Packers. I don't think that's a good idea. The United States comes down on you, they can really smash you. The Japanese know this. It's not just a few people. No, the Japanese leadership knows this. They're willing to gamble for a few basic reasons, one of which is the idea of honor. The other one is, well, maybe the Americans have no backbone. Ooh, you're going to bet on that? See, the Americans don't have a large military tradition. The Americans also have been isolationists. They act like they don't want to fight. The enemies of the United States have learned some very challenging lessons over the years in thinking that Americans are a bunch of wimps. Americans are tough. You get Americans angry, whoa, and you've got a problem on your hands. Because Americans will destroy you. The biggest, going back to that idea, the Japanese think they can cow the Americans by hurting them badly, and the Americans won't fight. Well, that's a bad gamble. And it literally blows up in their face. Well, there's the idea. We want to threaten, we want to take out the American fleet. Why do you do that? The American fleet, the American combat fleet, is the only power in the world that in any real sense can threaten the Japanese. Let's take out the American combat fleet. Now, until fairly recently, the American Pacific Fleet had been stationed in San Diego. That's down in Southern California. But the Americans moved their combat fleet, the Pacific Combat Fleet, to Hawaii, to Pearl Harbor. The reason the Americans did that was, well, we can take the, we can start using this as a point of threat, shall we say, to the Japanese. Well, the Japanese probably could have never struck at the Americans at San Diego, but on Hawaii, they probably could. Now, some people are saying to the Americans, well, look, you're provoking the Japanese. And the Americans say, look, we own Hawaii. It's part of the United States. We can move our goods and services, our combat fleet, and our military anywhere we want to in the United States. And I'm sorry, nobody else can tell us we can't. Then comes the attack on Pearl Harbor. Let's look at it from the Japanese standpoint. Can you imagine the huge, do I have this here? Can you imagine what they're attempting to do? Okay, this is Hawaii on this map. You're going to take a large combat fleet. In fact, the Japanese come with 6 aircraft carriers. You're going to take this very, very large combat fleet, thousands of miles across the Pacific Ocean, the North Pacific. They come essentially in this direction. They come across, and when they stage the attack on Pearl Harbor, they're going to come from the north. Can you actually do this? A large combat fleet? How on earth are you going to move a combat fleet across the Pacific Ocean and have not anybody see it? Well, remember, this is December. This is late in the year. The weather is not too good in the Northern Pacific. A lot of the vessels that would have been here in good weather are not here anymore. They're farther south. So there's not as much chance of running into anybody. They go all this distance and they're only seen by one ship. It was a Russian vessel. One of the great mysteries, in fact, the only real mystery that's left over in extensive studies done on the attack on Pearl Harbor, no one has ever decided what the Russian vessel did. They probably sent a message over the Vladivostok. The message was, if that was to happen, the message would have been sent to Stalin. And they sat on it. If they knew, why would you sit on it? Why wouldn't you tell the Americans what's coming down? This is a mystery that hasn't been resolved. I digress. The plan is stunning. The odds are so long that in reality, there's not much of a chance that it could possibly be pulled off. 2 factors involved: Japanese brilliance and American stupidity. Nobody, we have good naval commanders, we have good army commanders, we have people back in Washington, D.C., we have people in Hawaii. Nobody thought that there was really a credible threat. It's like, underestimate your enemies. Why would you think about this? This can't happen. We're reading Japanese codes. We know that they are going to strike within a few days of December 7th, but we don't know where. Of course, the Americans are saying, well, how about the Philippines? How about Southeast Asia? How about moving down here as well? Nobody actually thought of Hawaii. We have our spies in Japan, and it's very hard to hide an aircraft carrier. Aircraft carrier floats out, and there it is. Our spies have watched the aircraft carriers leave, but they don't know where they're going. Everybody thinks it can't be Hawaii. So the stealth involved is dramatic, and they time it perfectly. How you can leave Japan and go full bore and literally arrive exactly where you want to be within hours is stunning. They pick a weekend. The American servicemen during the weekend, Fred, hey, we don't want discipline anymore. Party time. Sunday morning's the best time. The Americans aren't even up yet. Virtually the crack of dawn, 7:50 in the morning. The Japanese come over and, shall we say, among other things, thoroughly embarrass the United States. They catch the U.S. fleet totally unprepared for battle at berth at Pearl Harbor. The Japanese, with a loss of 29 planes, they sent over 300 or close to 300 in this attack. They lost less than 10% in this attack. Shall we say that's low cost, if not minimal cost. Came in and sank 5 American battleships. Took out a lot of other ships as well. Shot up Hickam Field, shot up American planes on the tarmac before they could take off. Have literally trashed the American Pacific Fleet. Have literally trashed the American Air Corps in the Hawaiian Islands at a very small cost. A stunning victory, except then they start making mistakes. There was 2 strikes, 2 waves, I should say. Largely to take out the aircraft and largely to take out the ships. A third wave had been planned. What would you do with a third wave? You want to hit the facilities in Pearl Harbor to allow you to rebuild the ships. Another thing that they were supposed to do in the third wave was to hit the oil derricks at Pearl Harbor. This is where you get oil to send your ships out to sea. The third wave, third strike, never took place. The Japanese commander was upset because they hoped that there'd be aircraft carriers, which is the most important arm in the Pacific War, Pacific Naval War. There were no aircraft carriers. The Enterprise was supposed to be there, but she was held up by weather. There was no aircraft carriers. The Japanese don't know where the American aircraft carriers are. If the American aircraft carriers know where they are, and all of their planes are down bombing again Pearl Harbor or the area, then there is an opportunity that the Americans could come and catch these people literally napping and could do severe damage to this fleet, these 6 aircraft carriers. They're too valuable to risk. They're too valuable to be lost. Once again, let's play a counterfactual in history. Had the Japanese came on with that third strike and damaged the repair facilities at Pearl Harbor, taken out the oil, then it would have been very difficult for the Americans to repair that fleet. Some of these battleships that were sunk were actually later refloated and sent out to fight in the Pacific War. Had they taken out the oil, however, and sent their submarines, which had the range, they could do this, to interdict any oilers coming from the West Coast, largely San Diego, over to the Hawaiian Islands. They had sent their submarines out there who could have intimidated or damaged the American ability to bring oil back to Hawaii. That's a scenario by which the Japanese possibly could have won the war. At the end of the war, when the American historians are asking the Japanese, why didn't you do this? They're going, gee, I guess we could have done that. They never even thought of it. It's not just the Americans that are having, shall we say, blind ideas. The Japanese are as well. Well, so we have attacks at almost no cost, very little cost. The Japanese thought they'd at least use a few aircraft carriers. They lose nothing. They've got 10 aircraft carriers. The Americans have 4. Those are the odds early in the war. What the Americans can do? Not very much. In a sweeping success, they sweep down and take Indonesia, French Indochina. Yes, the Americans are defending the Philippines. The Americans are pushed back, and the Americans are forced to surrender on a peninsula called Bataan, which is next to Manila Harbor. Was it 14,000 Americans are captured? The Japanese are not prepared for prisoners. They look upon the American prisoners as lacking in honor, and they brutalize. There's a march, we call it the Bataan Death March, with the American prisoners of war, among also the Filipino prisoners of war, are marched to Camp O'Donnell, about 68 miles away. These men are sick. They had been starving. That's why they surrendered. And the Japanese sometimes are making sport with them. The Japanese do play baseball. They learned that from the Americans. And they tend to use their rifles as baseball bats and American heads as baseballs. When the Americans fall out, they're not allowed to help their other people. When a man falls out, they are killed. If you stagger, you fall down, you're killed. Sometimes they just drag men out of the line and they kill them by beheading them. Americans come out and are forced to dig graves where they're buried alive. I did mention when I was talking earlier about the controversies over the bombing campaign, strategic bombing during the Second World War. And I did mention the high loss of life in some of the bombing raids. When the Americans, starting in 1944, are routinely bombing the Japanese mainland. Firestorms burning cities. The opinion of a lot of Americans is not sympathetic to the Japanese at all. The vicious hatred the Americans had is really quite strong. When the bombing campaigns become well known, a typical attitude among many Americans was this: that'll teach these people, usually use an expletive right there, that will teach these people to have sneak attacks. Also, that will teach people of what's going to happen if you brutalize Americans. Okay, they attacked the United States. Britain still has holdings over here. Burma is a good example where the Japanese take Burma. There's a large garrison right here at Singapore, a British garrison, where the British are captured, and they are brutalized very much in the same way that Americans were brutalized over in the Philippines. The French Indochina had already been taken, and the Japanese treat their conquered peoples very, very badly. Race war, I've already mentioned this. Japanese thought they were superior to other peoples, which is a justification, among others, for treating these people as like human beings that have no right to exist. You should not treat them well. Starvation, rape, pillage. There's been a big flap over comfort women. Wherever the Japanese went, Korea, China, Philippines, they have what they call comfort women, where they take young women and force them to have sex with numerous Japanese soldiers, sometimes going on for years. Many years later, the survivor, and a lot of these women didn't survive. The experience was enough to kill some of them, and many of them did kill themselves, so they wouldn't have to keep on going through with this. Some of the survivors have tried to sue the Japanese for some time of regress, and they've really gotten nowhere. Going back to some of the ideology of the Japanese here. Oh, I jump ahead of myself here. I already talked about the Bataan Death March. The Japanese are not just thinking in terms of militarily destroying their enemies. How about biological and chemical warfare? Now, according to the Hague Conventions, which are the laws of war promulgated largely in 1907, this is illegal. But the Japanese are thinking, how can we defeat our enemies without sending armies? Remember, the Japanese are controlling large sections of China. There's many millions of people behind Japanese lines, and you tend to use these as human experiments. Unit 731, this is their biological and chemical experimentation unit, to see if they can spread smallpox, the plague, anthrax into various areas. Now, as horrible as this is, the Japanese want to make sure that their contagions and their chemicals are properly working. So you expose people to these things, and then you open them up, you eviscerate them, and you look inside. They're still alive. They get to feel this, to see how well the damage is being done to the body. They want to be most efficient and spread over large areas. And they do spread these in China. Thousands of Chinese die as part of an effort to see how effective they can be. This is on the level as bad as the Nazis doing human experiments on Jews and on other peoples during the Holocaust. Somehow we remember what the Nazis were doing, and somehow we forget what the Japanese were doing. Just jumping ahead to the end of the war, I think all these people involved in this should have been taken out and shot. When the Americans came in later on, they said, look, we won't execute you if you give us all your data. So you take all the data from these people, and Americans can maybe understand better and make use of it. I don't think you ought to make a deal with the devil. Anyway, talked about the Bataan Death March already. Let's turn the tide in the war. Let's talk about the Battle of Midway. I said that there were 10 Japanese aircraft carriers, and there's 4 American aircraft carriers in the Pacific. What are you going to do? Well, somehow, if the United States is trying to stop Japan, they're going to have to use these 4 aircraft carriers to their advantage. On December 7th, 1941, the Americans are reading the Japanese diplomatic codes. It's not until after the attack on Pearl Harbor that the Americans are starting to read Japanese military codes, naval and army. But starting in early 1942, the Americans do have a keen insight in what the Japanese are doing. The Japanese want to move against Australia. The reason for that is Australia has a lot of natural resources. Another reason for this is, can I move this back here a little bit? No. Another reason for this is that the Australian Army, one of the best armies in the world. In fact, we do make arguments that of any nation in the 20th century, the Australians have the best army in the world. Their accomplishments in World War I, their accomplishments in World War II, their accomplishments in Vietnam adequately demonstrate this. These are really, really good boys. These are good you're going to see anywhere. But they're fighting in North Africa. So the Japanese think, well, we just come down here, maybe we can start hitting Australia. I'm going to argue against Japanese ideas. It's probably a stupid idea. Australia's really, really big, and that's a long ways from Japan. Anyway, right here, I don't know if you can see it on this map, there is a place called Port Moresby. The Japanese have taken the northern part of New Guinea. Well, they want to send a carrier fleet around this other side so they can actually invade and take Port Moresby. The Americans know they're coming, so the Americans send out their aircraft carriers. And in the Battle of the Coral Sea, this is one of the first really Navy-to-Navy engagements in the history of warfare where the surface vessels never even saw each other. It's totally taken out by aircraft. Well, the Japanese attack the American aircraft. The Americans attack Japanese aircraft. The Japanese lose 1 aircraft carrier. The Americans lose 1 aircraft carrier. They lose the Lexington. She goes down. I interviewed a man who was on the Lexington, gave an interesting story about how they got off the ship, and they didn't know what was going on because they're below decks. They can hear the noise, and anyway, when he got off, they're swimming. And they go, "How do you do in the water, right?" And he had more stripes. He was a higher grade petty officer. The other people were. He started swimming in one direction. Everybody started swimming with him. Well, very fortunately, they were picked up very rapidly, American destroyers, and taken away. Okay, the United States has lost the Lexington, and the Yorktown is badly damaged. In fact, she was burning. The Japanese saw this. They believe that though they didn't see it go down, they believe either it was going to go down or that it would take so long to repair it that essentially it is out of action. What had happened is the Lexington down here in the Battle of Coral Sea, they took her, Lexington, I should say Yorktown, they took her all the way back to Pearl Harbor. That's the closest repair facility that's available in the Pacific. They took her all the way back to Pearl Harbor. And in one of the more stunning examples of American ingenuity during the entire war, they've got her ship shape and back on the water in 3 days. Normally, you would say those kind of repairs would be 1 month. However, this is this. The Japanese think the Americans got 2 aircraft carriers, and they've got 9. The Japanese start making mistakes. Sometimes historians and even the Japanese themselves have actually called this the victor's disease. It's like you just get too enthusiastic over what you're doing. You actually start not even believing in your prowess. When this kind of thing happens, you start to make mistakes. A couple of Japanese aircraft carriers are taken all the way back to Tokyo for minimal repairs, the kinds of things that didn't really matter. You see, when the Japanese start marching on Midway, marching is the wrong term, sailing toward Midway, they've got 4 aircraft carriers. They could have had 6. Had they had 6, I firmly believe that the outcome of the battle would have been completely different. Well, this is the idea. The Japanese say, well, let's take out the Americans. The American base in the Pacific is the Hawaiian Islands. Let's take the Hawaiian Islands. On the way, let's take out Midway. Take out Midway. Midway's a good staging area. The Japanese can use this as a port to send attacks against Hawaii. So they want to take out Midway. The Americans are reading the Japanese codes. They know they're coming, and they know they're coming to Midway. So the Japanese think 4 aircraft carriers against 2. If the Americans show up, the Americans might not even show up. Okay, this should be pretty easy. Can we say the luck of the Japanese have been extremely good before this time frame? At this point, can we say the luck starts going finally for the Americans? Okay, they've got the 3 aircraft carriers, the Japanese have 4. Those are the odds. The Americans have a fighting chance. The Japanese are going to soften up Midway with an airstrike. So they come in with an airstrike, they drop bombs. American filmmaker is on Midway, so we have nice pictures of burning buildings and people trying to fight against the Japanese. The Japanese come in and they hit. And they fly back to their carriers, and they're thinking about another strike on the ground. In other words, they put bombs on these things for another ground strike. In the meantime, the American planes show up. Some of the first planes to attack the Japanese carriers were torpedo bombers. These are bombers, maybe I shouldn't call it bombers. In any event, these are aircraft, the 2-man crew. And you come in at a low level, right above the water. You kind of head straight for the aircraft carriers. You drop the torpedo in the water. Supposedly, the torpedo will go in, come out, and hit your target. Each one of these ships, each one of these American aircraft are shot down. But they're down here low. And the Japanese take their aircraft, their fighter aircraft, to defend the fleet down to take them out. So now, up above the fleet, the Japanese aren't being defended. And the aircraft on the deck can't get up because they are configured improperly. And they're trying to put ground attack bombs on them. When the American planes show up, they realize American carriers are nearby. And now they want to put on something to attack ships with. Back to the Americans, American dive bombers from the Enterprise, Yorktown. And they look down, and there's the Japanese fleet. It is not defended by Japanese aircraft. So the Americans come down. In literally 5 minutes, the Americans scratch 3 Japanese aircraft carriers. They're hitting the deck. Of course, all the fuel and the ammunition's there, and the bombs are there, blow up and burns, and yeah, they lose them. They got 1 left. And there had been a strike sent over to the Americans, and they pick 1 aircraft carrier at random. It happens to be the Yorktown. They come in, they hit her quite heavily. She is set on fire. They fly back. By the time they get back, they realize that they come back and 3 aircraft carriers are gone. So they didn't have a place to land. A lot of these people just ditch in the ocean. The pilots are picked up later. But they think they've scratched an American aircraft carrier. The remaining ship, the remaining aircraft carrier, sends out another strike against the American carriers. They come out and they see the 3 American aircraft carriers. They know the one was on fire, but the American fire repression men on the ship had put it out. So the Japanese don't know which one they'd hit. They know it's severely damaged. It'd be their best interest to hit one that was not damaged. So they came down and attacked another ship at random, which happened to be the Yorktown again. This time they really do a number on her. The fires get started again. She's listing. They managed to keep her afloat. However, from the other aircraft carriers, the Hornet and the Enterprise, the Americans fly back and take out that fourth aircraft carrier. The Yorktown's in bad shape. She kind of limps on. A few days later, a Japanese submarine sees her and puts a fish in her, and she goes down. We lost one aircraft carrier. We got two left. We lost one aircraft carrier. Now the Japanese lost four. This is one of the greatest major victories in the history of naval warfare. This literally turns the tide on the war with Japan. While the Japanese were still capable of making offensive operations against their enemies as of June 1942, when the Battle of Midway took place. The Japanese never staged another offensive throughout the remainder of the war. I'm not going to say the Japanese did not have a chance to pull out a victory, but I am going to say, under these circumstances, they simply lose over and over again. By this time in the war, 6 months into the war, by this time into the war, the United States industrial capacity is geared up, and they're producing ships, they're producing aircraft carriers, they're producing aircraft, and the Japanese have no way of matching this. In the entire history of the war, the Japanese are able to build about 200 vessels, while the United States are going to build over 2,000 vessels, a literally 10-to-1 advantage. With this enormous capability, the United States is able to knock out the Japanese one after another. We call this island hopping. You don't have to take all the islands, you just have to take strategic islands. Essentially, the transport aircraft the Americans were using is the C-47. Its range was something like 1,500 miles. So what you would do actually is you would take an island here that you have to have an air base. It has to be big enough for an air base. And you simply come in, you put an air base on this. And then you go up here, you bypass all these other places you don't need. So the Japanese garrison sit there and they get hungry and starve for the remainder of the war. They're not involved in combat. And the Americans take island after island. Some of the controversies: was it necessary to take the Philippines? Hundreds of thousands of people die. I don't know. Let's not turn this into a World War II class. Though I've taught World War II class a number of times, it would be tempting. Let's just look at some of the controversies very late in the war. Let's look at U.S. strategic bombing. Well, I've already told you in your lecture about the controversies on was this necessary, was it wise? I don't think it's necessary to revisit that. I did mention that the largest single raid of the war was in March 1945, when between 90,000 and maybe 250,000 Japanese were killed in the city of Tokyo. To my knowledge, I don't know everything about history, but to my knowledge, this is the biggest single loss of human life in one day in the entire history of the world. Well, the Japanese are sending out feelers. They're trying to think about if they can surrender and what terms they would get if they did. However, there's bombs. The United States had been producing the first nuclear weapons. One is made of uranium, the other is made of plutonium. These are radioactive elements. If you push them together, essentially push them together, you can be a simple device. You can have uranium here and uranium here, have explosion behind, they go together and blow it up. Another way you can do this, of course, is to have pieces of uranium or plutonium around in a circle. And then you explode on the outside and they all come in together. Nuclear weapons against Hiroshima and Nagasaki. I don't want to dodge this. On the other hand, going into a lengthy discussion on all of this, would be very challenging for an introductory class. Can we say it's very controversial? At the time, people are really glad to have the war over with. Anything will just even speed up the war ending. A lot of public opinion would support that. Why is it controversial? Why don't we see bigger controversies about burning Tokyo? One of the controversies is the first time nuclear weapons were used in a war. Was that wise? Because even though it shortens the war, is it a bad precedent to ever having used nuclear weapons, which makes it a little bit more likely during the Cold War, if people are worried about what we call mutual assured destructions, where the Soviet Union and the United States can obliterate each other, was it wise to actually have started the use of nuclear weapons initially? Well, this has been an interest of mine. I've read a number of books and followed magazine, newspaper articles for a very lengthy period of time. I will say absolutely, I've been all over the map on this. There were times when I said, I don't know this was necessary to win the war. There are other times I've come down and said it's absolutely necessary. It's absolutely what we needed to do. I'm not going to resolve that for you right now, because I don't think I've resolved it in my mind even yet. But let me say this. It's an interesting aspect of this that the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki has become somewhat politicized. I find that very odd. Why is a historical event like the burning of Atlanta in 1864? Why would one modern political party take leanings left and right, would take a look at that as something that should support our standpoint? Well, initially, the liberals thought it was a good idea. Harry Truman, as you know, was a liberal, and he was the person who ordered the strike. At exactly the same time, conservatives, Dwight Eisenhower, very conservative president of the United States, and also Herbert Hoover, also a very conservative president of the United States, thought it was unwise. Now that's switched. Now the liberals are thinking maybe it was unnecessary, and the conservatives are thinking it was necessary. So even as a political issue, this has shifted. Maybe I'm giving too much of a pitch here. I honestly think it might be a little bit better to let the historians discuss this, let the historians gripe with each other, let the historians argue, than taking this into the political realm. I'm not sure it belongs there. Now let's see where we are for time. I'm running a little bit down on time. We have a few minutes left. Let me do this for our remaining few minutes. Remember, a while ago I got confused and I didn't really level off with any Napoleon when I should have. I let it drag and I went over it a little bit. Let me give you a few minutes off, but I'm at least going to introduce the next discussion. Let's talk about modern China. While Japan isn't such a big deal after the war, China has become a major power. One thing I do want to mention, which I shouldn't let go, is that rather than just leaving Japan there as having surrendered, Japan is actually one of the more progressive democracies we see in the world today. A U.S. general who actually fought in the Philippines, Douglas MacArthur, goes to Japan at the end of the war. And he's actually the man who's really causing U.S. policy in Japan. This guy's a pretty clever man. He comes in and decides to write a constitution for Japan. He reads a bunch of constitutions. He reads the constitution saying, this is a good idea, whatever. He writes the constitution for Japan. It's considered to be very good. In fact, the Japanese are using it even today. While it's hard for the Japanese to honor a general who killed a lot of Japanese, particularly in the Philippines, in the retaking the Philippines in 1944 and 1945, he's actually honored for being a pretty astute politician. I find this very amusing. MacArthur wants to, shall we say, defang Japan from its militarism. Of course, he's going to prosecute war crimes, war criminals who had murdered American prisoners of war, among other things. He's going to do that. So he's going to kind of take the old military leadership and remove them. It is helpful that at the end of the war, there are threats in Asia, communists in Russia, communists in China. And however, the United States ends up having military bases in Japan. One of the more prevalent is one here down in Okinawa, where the Marines have a division even today. And you have the Americans essentially paying for your defense. So Japan doesn't really need much of a big military right now. Of course, their economic strength, I've already mentioned this a couple of times, we don't have to grab resources. You can trade for them, you can buy them. But one of the ways that MacArthur decided that he could defang the military of Japan is give women the right to vote. Women, according to MacArthur, are much less likely to vote for large military budgets. Women are much less likely to support politicians who want to take their sons and husbands out into a military situation. Can we say this is a factor in Japan today? Yes, it is. I do wish one thing that the Japanese have not really done yet. They really haven't fessed up to their crimes. They haven't given money to the comfort women. They haven't given money to the Americans, whom in many cases they worked to death, American prisoners of war, they worked to death and under terribly challenging conditions in the mines in Japan. That I wish they would do. But Japan, in many respects, is very admirable to this day. Anyway, let's go on and talk about modern China next time. In the meantime, whatever you're doing, however it's coming down, I hope you're having the most wonderful time. And I'll talk to you again next time.